Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. So, Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens was the mega Dickens Readalong book for March and April. If you don't know what the mega Dickens Readalong is, I will leave some links down below, but basically this is a 2-year-long read-along where we're reading all of the works of Charles Dickens in publication order, and we are nearing the end now, which is very, very strange. The end is very much in sight, and it has been a great reading project so far. So yes, in March I read Little Dorrit, which I loved a great deal. So today I'm just going to be discussing my thoughts about Little Dorrit. I have many thoughts and lots to say. There will be some spoilers later on in the video, but I will keep the first section spoiler free. So before anything else, let's have a quick chat about what Little Dorrit is about. So Little Dorrit is a novel that follows a character called Amy Dorrit. She is the Little Dorrit of the title. She's 22 years old, but she's very physically small, hence why some people call her Little Dorrit. And her father has been imprisoned for debt in the Marshalsea prison for more than 20 years. Amy goes out to work during the day to try and support her father and her siblings, but at night she returns to the Marshalsea prison where her father lives. Her father has not been out for more than 20 years, and Amy herself was born within the Marshalsea prison. And we follow what happens when she crosses paths with a man called Arthur Clenham. Arthur Clenham is about 40 years old. He's just come back from many years working abroad, and he returns to England to see his mother again, to give up his share in the family business, and he finds that Amy Dorrit is working at his mother's house, although it's not quite clear to him that she's really needed there. And because Arthur's mother very rarely shows any kindness to anyone, and because his father died with some kind of guilt on his conscience, Arthur believes, Arthur begins to wonder if his mother and his family business may have wronged the Dorrit family at some point in the past, so he makes an effort to befriend Amy to try and find out more about this, and the book kind of follows their friendship and many other things going on around them. This was my 5th or 6th read, I would say, and I listened to this on audiobook. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Juliet Stevenson, which is a wonderful audiobook. This is the second time I've listened to this audiobook, and it is worth every one of its many hours. It is fantastic. Juliet Stevenson is such a great narrator. She does such wonderful voices. Her performance of Panks is just like absolutely supreme. Mr. Panks has a very distinctive way of speaking, shall we say, and Juliet Stevenson does it very well. It's a great audiobook. As I said, this was my 5th or 6th reading of Little Dorrit. I have read this many times before and I love it a lot. It is my 3rd favourite Dickens, I would say. Like, it's one of my absolute favourites, and I really enjoyed this reread. I would say that it remains firmly my 3rd favourite Dickens. I laughed, I cried, I just had a wonderful time reading it. Yeah, I just think it's great. It was also quite nice to read after Hard Times, because Hard Times is very short, and I love Hard Times. I think it's wonderful, but there's also a bit of me that just loves the really like hefty Dickens book that you can get lost in, and it's filled with like lots of different characters and interweaving plots. I just really like that, so I really enjoyed that experience of Little Dorrit as well. And yeah, it's just a great book, a great reading experience for me. Part of the purpose of the mega Dickens read-along for me has been to read Dickens's novels in publication order and think about them in chronology and how they kind of lead on from one another and how his writing changes over the course of his career. I find it interesting that Little Dorrit falls in between Hard Times and A Tale of Two Cities, because both of those two are like shorter, more compact novels, and Little Dorrit for me it feels much more like a follow-on from Bleak House, and it also feels much more like a book that leads on to Our Mutual Friend, whereas Dickens's other late novels, Hard Times, A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations, are all kind of shorter and more compact. While I love Dombey and Son a lot, and while Dombey and Son is probably my 2nd favourite Dickens book, I would say that for me his 3 like masterpieces are probably Little Dorrit, Bleak House and Our Mutual Friend. Like, for me they are the kind of pinnacles of Dickens's career and his writing, and they are the big epic masterpieces with a lot of different characters and a lot of different plots weaving together, and they're the 3 books that kind of capture the essence of Dickens for me, and that like capture everything I love about Dickens. I love Dombey and Son a lot, and I love it more than Little Dorrit probably, and definitely more than Bleak House, but I feel like it's a slightly different book than Our Mutual Friend, Little Dorrit and Bleak House. Maybe just because it takes place over a number of years, whereas Bleak House, Little Dorrit and Our Mutual Friend, those 3 all kind of take place over a relatively similar time span of a couple of years rather than like a decade like Dombey and Son. Anyway, within Little Dorrit we see quite a lot of themes come up that have come up in earlier Dickens books, such as siblings taking a particular sibling for granted, which we saw in Hard Times and we'll see later later in Our Mutual Friend. We also see debtors' prisons, which we've encountered in the Pickwick Papers and David Copperfield. Dickens' own father spent some time in a debtors' prison when he was a child, and this obviously had quite a big impact on him, and it's something he wrote about quite a lot. There's also a lot of social criticism within Little Dorrit, where Bleak House was criticising the legal system and chancery, and Hard Times was criticising utilitarianism. Little Dorrit is very critical of the civil service and of the nepotism and bureaucracy within it, and Charles Dickens uses the circumlocution office to kind of stand in for the whole civil service and how kind of ineffective and useless he thought it was at what it was trying to do. For me, Amy Dorrit as a heroine sort of feels like a step up from Esther as a heroine, and kind of like leading on to the great heights that Dickens will reach with Lizzie Hexam in Our Mutual Friend, his best heroine. Although I do have a real soft spot for Amy, but Lizzie Hexam is like cooler than Amy. But I think it's really interesting if we think about the novels with kind of central female characters. We have Florence in Dombey and Son, we have Esther in Bleak House. You could argue that Louisa is the main character of Hard Times, but I think it's a bit more debatable. Then we have Amy in Little Dorrit, and then we have Lizzie and Bella in Our Mutual Friend. They're not the main characters, but they probably have a similar, like, Louisa level role. But I would say the three novels that do have a female central character are Dombey and Son, Bleak House, and Little Dorrit. And for me, I feel like Amy feels like a bit of a step up from Esther Summerson. Like, for me, she feels like a slightly more believable, slightly more complex Esther. I don't know, I do really like Esther too, but I like Amy more, and I really enjoy her as a character. And she's also, interestingly, the only female title character in Dickens's books. If you think about how many male title characters he has, that's kind of interesting that she gets the title of Little Dorrit. Someone on the Discord server said that they thought Mrs. Clenham was a kind of early model for Miss Havisham, who will meet in Great Expectations in a couple of books' time. And I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't thought of it before, but you can definitely see similar themes between Miss Havisham and Mrs. Clenham. And Miss Havisham, I would say, is a more important part of Great Expectations than Mrs. Clenham is of Little Dorrit. But like Miss Havisham, she hasn't left her home for a very, very long time, has some kind of secret, and is kind of quite like cold and distant to those around her. I think for me, I had always seen Mrs. Clenham as a kind of like female Mr. Dombey from Dombey and Son, in her kind of like neglectful, distancing parenting style towards Arthur, and in her focus on business. So it's very strange to draw a line between like Mr. Dombey and Miss Havisham, but I think that's kind of fun. Anyway, I want to talk briefly about the plot, but there's not too much I can say about the plot of Little Dorrit without spoilers, because the plot makes some unexpected turns. Personally, I really, really love the plot of Little Dorrit, and I really enjoy its change in direction. I think that probably the plot of Little Dorrit is probably more driven by character relationships than it is by like external conflict, which is not the case in Bleak House or Hard Times. And I feel like that's maybe one of the reasons why quite a few people on the Discord server kind of didn't get on with Little Dorrit as well, which really surprised me actually, because I really very much view it as one of his best. For quite a lot of the earlier Dickens books, if people didn't get on with them, I really understood why. Whereas I feel like Little Dorrit has been, of all the books in the Mega Dickens Readalong so far, the one where I've been the most surprised by people's reactions to it. And I was trying to think this through, and I think one of the reasons why quite a few people sort of struggled with it or found the pacing a bit strange in the first half especially is because the plot is more character driven than conflict driven, and because the direction that the plot is going to take is very much not clear. Like, as a reread, I love the plot, and the plot is amazing, but it's been so long since I read it for the first time, and I can kind of imagine that when you're reading Little Dorrit for the first time, the direction the plot is taking is not very clear, and you're not necessarily sure what to focus on as much, I guess. Like, I really love the plot of Little Dorrit, but it is very much a character relationship driven plot, rather than having like a clear kind of central conflict at the heart of it, I suppose, as the previous few novels have. For me, it is very much a novel about class and unrequited love, and the unrequited love elements of this book are like one of my favourite things, which I'll talk about a bit more later. Do I think we could do with seeing a bit more of a villain in Little Dorrit? Yes, maybe, but to be honest, I don't really mind, and he's kind of such a memorable character that works for me. Is the ending slightly convoluted? Yes, possibly, but I don't care. It's Dickens. He likes things to be convoluted. I just think it's wonderful. I love it for the emotion and the themes and the characterisation. I just find it one of the most moving, emotive Dickens books. and I really love the characters and find them really like complicated and interesting. So anyway, let's move on to characters, because that's the next point on my list. So we have Amy Dorrit, who is, the heroine of the novel, and probably my favourite Dickens heroine. I mean, do I love Lizzie Hexam more? I sort of think Lizzie Hexam is a more interesting, better, stronger heroine, but I really love Amy Dorrit. I feel like she's got a lot of internal strength and a lot of like emotional and practical intelligence. We see a lot of kindness from her, but we also see a sort of like deep understanding of other people. She's one of those characters who looks after everyone around her, but is also like quite aware of her own feelings and what she wants, and I just really enjoy her as a character. Every now and then I do wonder if one of the reasons why I love Amy so much is because she is really short, and I am quite short. I don't think I'm as short as Little Dorrit is meant to be, but I read this first as a teenager when I guess I was like 14, 15, and I was quite aware that like lots of my friends were still growing and I hadn't grown for like 3 or 4 years, so maybe that like especially endeared me to Amy from the beginning. But anyway, we also have Arthur Clennam, the male protagonist of Little Dorrit, who is, I think, by a very long way my favourite male protagonist in all of Dickens. He is even maybe my favourite protagonist in all of Dickens, is that true? I just really love Arthur a lot. I think he is a wonderful, really interesting character. There's a lot of interesting things going on in Little Dorrit to do with masculinity. You know, I'm always going to talk about gender when it comes to Dickens. That's what I wrote my dissertation on at university. And I feel like if you compare a very boring, bland archetype of what a male hero should be, such as Nicholas Nickleby from Nicholas Nickleby, to Clennam, like Clennam is such a more complicated, interesting character, and he is a lot more like emotional and sensitive and caring, and has a like very different model of masculinity to a character such as Nicholas Nickleby, which I think is really, really interesting. Arthur Clennam cries multiple times in the book, which you don't get that often with the male protagonists of Victorian novels. He is a really like lovely, endearing character, but he also kind of makes mistakes, and he feels just very, very human and very believable. I also really enjoy the way Dickens looks at his age. So Arthur is 40, and he very much feels that he is kind of on the cusp of like different stages of life, and there are moments in the book where he feels that he is quite a young man, and there are other moments in the book where he feels like he's getting old, and he almost kind of moves his mindset to being older than he is, and I feel like that just feels very like human and complex, and I really like that. I just really, really like Arthur Clennam, basically. I think he is a wonderful, wonderful character. We also have the whole Dorrit family, who I think are incredible. I know a lot of people find the Dorrit family quite frustrating. I think that's another reason why quite a few people didn't get on with Little Dorrit as a book, but I really like reading about the Dorrit family. Even when they are awful, I still really like reading about them, and I still really feel for them. So within the rest of the Dorrit family, we have Mr. Dorrit, Amy's father, we have his brother Frederick, Amy's uncle, and then we have Amy's 2 older siblings, Edward or Tip and Fanny. And the two I feel like we get to know the most are probably Mr. Dorrit and Fanny, both of whom are quite frustrating characters in some ways, but I also really enjoy them as characters, and I also feel very sorry for them. I feel like Mr. Dorrit is very complexly and interestingly drawn, and I feel like he feels very believable, and I feel like the more I read it, the more I feel sympathy and pain for him rather than disliking him. Like, I know the way he treats Amy isn't really okay, and all of the whole family kind of rely on her in a way that isn't acceptable, but I think you can also really see the way they've all been really messed up by their weird life, and her father especially, the way he's been impacted by spending more than 2 decades in prison for debt, and how that's kind of affected his mental health, and the way he relates to everyone around him. I feel like that is really, really clear and really, really interesting, and that's kind of one of my favourite things in Little Dorrit. I feel like that's done really well. And Fanny Dorrit too, like in some ways she's such a frustrating character, and she, you know, is so different from Amy, and at times is rude to Amy, but she also, like, you can see that she really, really loves her sister very, very much. My reading of Fanny Dorrit has always been that she doesn't understand her sister Amy at all, but she really, really loves her. She really cares about her, but she doesn't understand her, and that means that she can't behave to Amy in the way that she should, because she just can't fathom Amy because she's so different from her. And there are a few moments with Fanny, I think especially in the second half, where you get a real, like, internal depth and complexity within her, and you see how disappointed she is by herself and her life in some ways, and I just kind of think that's great and really well done. I also really enjoy Frederick Dorrit as a character. He's probably the nicest one of the family. The Dorrit family are very proud of their birth and their blood, even though they have very much fallen on hard times, but they have a real pride of being like, gentlemen and ladies, basically, even though that is not the position in life they occupy now. And I feel like that can be very frustrating as a reader. But I also think from the social context of the time, it is very, very believable, and would probably be quite annoying, but less annoying to Victorian readers, I guess. I guess maybe the reason why I kind of feel for the rest of the Dorrit family rather than finding them frustrating is because I sort of feel like I can see them through Amy's eyes and kind of forgive them. I don't know, I really enjoy reading about the Dorrit family. I feel like the messy and at times frustrating Dorrit family proved like a stumbling block for quite a lot of people who are taking part in the Mega Dickens Readalong, whereas I feel like for me, they make the book. Like, I think they are one of my favourite elements of the book. I spent quite a long time talking about the Dorrits there, but I do have a few other characters to mention. I've mentioned Mrs. Clennam once already, but I do find her a really interesting character. Again, very interesting in terms of gender dynamics. She is very, very tough and stony, and she has a lot of traits that, to be honest, in an early Dickens novel, only a man would have ever had. Like Mr. Dombey, she is exceptionally business-minded and cares about money, but she also has the kind of like religious hypocrisy of a character like Mr. Pecksniff. I find Mrs. Clennam a really interesting character. I think Mr. Panks might be like one of my slow burn absolute favourite Dickens characters ever. Like, I feel like there are many excellent eccentric characters throughout Dickens's body of work, and Mr. Panks is one of the best. And I feel like he's a character who I have always liked, but actually the more I read Little Dorrit, the more I'm like, yeah, Mr. Panks, he is the best. What a fascinating, fun character. I feel like he's just extra special on the audiobook with Juliet Stevenson's wild depiction of him and all his sniffing. What a great character. I also really like Daniel Doyce as an inventor. Like, he's a really fun character. I like John Chivery, the turnkey's son who is desperately in love with Amy Dorrit. I find Mr. Merdle a very interesting character, Mrs. Merdle too. I kind of adore Edmund Sparkler as a character. I find Blanwell quite interesting, though I do maybe think we could have done with a bit more of him, but I still find him an interesting character. I really like Miss Wade. I feel like I don't know if I view Miss Wade as Dickens views her, but I do find her a very interesting character. Then we have the Meagles, who I have slightly divided feelings about. Basically, I really enjoy the friendship between Mr. Meagles and Arthur Clennam, but I do struggle with the Harriet/Tattycoram plotline. And Harriet is a character who I do slightly struggle with because I really like her as a character, but I really struggle with her arc because Dickens very much wants me to think differently about her arc than I do. Dickens definitely wants me to be on Mr. Meagles' side, and I'm definitely on Miss Wade's side, but there we go. Another character I struggle with a little bit is Flora Finching. I feel like Flora is one of those characters who kind of falls into a bit of the Mrs. Nickleby trap from Nicholas Nickleby, where it does feel like she's a silly woman just because she's a woman and not in her 20s, but at the same time, she is so good-hearted and so eccentric and unique, and the way Dickens writes her is kind of really fun, so I do kind of really like her, but I also resent the fact I like her. There are lots of very interesting themes within Little Dorrit. As with many Dickens novels, there are quite a lot of elements of social criticism going on here. One of the biggest elements of social criticism within Little Dorrit is about bureaucracy and the Circumlocution Office, which is Dickens' kind of stand-in for the civil service. As with Chancery in Bleak House, Charles Dickens is basically saying that the civil service is kind of just wasting everyone's time. It's getting in the way of progress rather than helping it. And he also really criticises the nepotism within it. You know, we have the Barnacle family who are just to be found in like every public office possible. None of them are very intelligent. None of them want to actually make a difference. You know, they're all just of like good birth, and therefore they get into these positions and cling on to British society, kind of dragging it down and making everything worse. They're all basically useless, but because of their birth and because of their connections, they therefore get into all of these positions, and there's this big, you know, massive sprawling family kind of standing in for lots of different families and basically for a particular element of the upper classes. And I find the Circumlocution Office very, very interesting in Little Dorrit. I think especially because I read quite a lot of Anthony Trollope, and Anthony Trollope writes quite a lot about the civil service, and actually his civil service characters are often from the middle classes and not from the class of the Barnacles, which is quite interesting. And Anthony Trollope did work in the civil service, so I feel like he probably knew quite a lot more about it than Charles Dickens did. But I find it quite interesting to look at like the very different depictions of the civil service. I just feel like the Circumlocution Office is quite a fun, like, social criticism element that Dickens introduces into Little Dorrit. Another element of social criticism we find in Little Dorrit is about religion. This is a more minor element, but Mrs. Clennam like subscribes to a particular kind of Christianity, which is very, very harsh and very strict and very limiting. And you can really see how that has affected Arthur, and how that affects how she views everyone. There is no kindness or compassion or mercy within her brand of Christianity. It is all strict moral codes, and the complete absence of forgiveness, and that is quite interestingly sort of looked at and criticised within Little Dorrit. There are obviously a lot of themes of money within Little Dorrit. You know, the main character's father is in prison for debt. We also have Mr. Casby kind of constantly squeezing Bleeding Heart dry through Mr. Panks, and kind of requesting rent and money always, and trying really, really hard to get as much money out of people who don't have it as possible. We also have Mrs. Clenham and her company and their financial dealings. We have Mr. Merdle and his company and the themes of investments and capitalism that come through him. And there's just a lot of really interesting things going on in Little Dorrit to do with money and kind of the dangers of money, but also the dangers of not having enough money, I suppose. And tying into the themes of money, of course, we have the theme of class. And Amy and her family have a very complicated class position. You know, Amy's father was born a gentleman, but they are now very, very impoverished, and they rely on Amy's work as a seamstress, on Fanny's work as a dancer, and on the testimonials, as he calls them, that Mr. Dorrit can basically beg from the people who come to see him. And basically Amy is the only one who has kind of accepted their class position, and that is looked at in a really interesting way in Little Dorrit. And then we also have the division between the sort of like business-led and middle classes that Mr. Clenham and the Meagles belong to, as opposed to the high society of people such as Mrs. Merdle and Mrs. Gowan. We see quite a lot in this novel the kind of divisions between those two groups of people, and how Dickens very much does not approve of the high society lot. I've already spoken a little bit about gender in Little Dorrit, but that is always a theme that interests me in Dickens. Arthur and his mother are a really interesting pair of characters to look at in terms of Dickens breaking down gender norms and gender roles. Arthur breaks a lot of ideas about Victorian masculinity. He is much more emotional and sensitive than Victorian men were, you know, kind of meant to be, and definitely he is a lot more emotional and sensitive than his mother. There's a mention at one point of Arthur crying manly tears, which is just not a description that you would ever get in an early Dickens book, and I do think you can really see how all of his characterisation, but especially his kind of characterisation to do with gender, really changes a lot over the course of his books. And then we have his mother, who, as I said, kind of embodies a lot of things which are typically male within the Victorian imagination. She is very, very cold. She cares more about the family business than she seems to about her son. Amy also has quite an interesting role within her family, because she has basically taken on the role of being the breadwinner. She is sort of the head of the family, even though that is completely unacknowledged. She is the one that everyone relies on, which is not traditionally the role for the youngest daughter within a family at this point in time. This novel also has stuff to say about power dynamics within marriage and about abusive marriages. We see the relationship between Jeremiah and Afri, which is just really, really horrible, and the way he treats her, his physical and psychological abuse, and his gaslighting of her is really starkly drawn, and adds a really like heavy, serious element to Little Dorrit, I think. And domestic abuse is something that Dickens has kind of touched on in earlier novels too, and you can really see him criticising unequal power dynamics in marriage through that plot line. Another very interesting theme in Little Dorrit is that of imprisonment, and of imprisonment versus liberty. The novel Little Dorrit begins in a prison. In chapter 1 we are following Rigaud and Cavaletto, two men who are in a French prison in Marseille. In the next chapter, still in Marseille, we're following Mr. Clenham and the Meagles, who have just got out of quarantine. They have been quarantined because they've been travelling, and they have been imprisoned temporarily before they can carry on with their journey. Of course, we also have Mr. Dorrit, who has been imprisoned in the Marshalsea prison for debt for decades. We have Mrs. Clenham, who never leaves her room. We even have a character like Daniel Doyce, who is kind of like stuck and imprisoned within the circumlocution office system. And I feel like that theme of imprisonment versus liberty, and how you can be imprisoned both physically and by, you know, a mindset or by other people or by circumstances, is something that's really interestingly explored within Little Dorrit. We also have a sense, I think, of the sort of trauma that imprisonment can cause, and that's a really interesting element within the book too. Another theme kind of related to that is sort of secrets, patience, and suffering in silence. There are a lot of secrets being kept within Little Dorrit, and there are a lot of people kind of pretending in some way or another, either kind of adopting a disguise of sorts, or suffering in silence, or pretending they don't feel as they do, or putting on some kind of facade. And that kind of divorce between like the face that you show to the world and what's actually going on is quite an interesting element within Little Dorrit. And kind of leading on from the theme of secrets, another really important theme within Little Dorrit is unrequited love. I love how Little Dorrit as a book looks at unrequited love, and I feel like the way this book explores unrequited love is probably one of the things that really elevates it for me as a novel, and one of the things that means I love it so, so much. I have a lot more to say about unrequited love, but it's all going to be quite spoilery, so if you haven't read Little Dorrit, now is the time to stop the video, and if you have, please do continue. I have many more things to say. So, unrequited love in Little Dorrit, what a great theme, it's done so well. Arthur's unrequited love for Minnie/Pet, I think is really, really well written. I think the device of nobody is used so well. It's one of my favourite like Dickensian writing techniques. I really enjoy how he focuses on nobody. Mr. Clenham decides that he's not going to be in love with Pet because she's clearly in love with someone else and he's too old anyway, so he's not going to be in love with her. And of course he is. But this device of, if Clenham had made a different choice, then he would be upset at this point. But he's decided he's not going to fall in love with her, so he's not upset. Nobody's upset. It's all fine. I feel like that is both a really effective like writing device, but it also feels like a very human way for Arthur to distance himself from his feelings. Like, I think it works really, really well. I really love the scene between Arthur and Minnie, where they speak after she's, you know, properly got engaged to Mr. Gowan, and they both know how he feels about her, but neither of them are going to say. But they both know, and so it's really painful, and it's really, really emotional. And then afterwards, when Mr. Meagles and Arthur talk, and Mr. Meagles says that he imagines that his daughter who died many years ago had grown up and loved Arthur, and Mr. Meagles finds a way to kind of view Arthur and accept Arthur as a son-in-law, even though he knows that will never be. I was listening to that scene on audiobook while I was doing a workout. I was like there, lifting my weights, doing my squats, like tears running down my face. It was very emotional. And then the way that Arthur's love for Minnie changes him, and how after he knows there's no hope, he kind of decides, oh, he's old, he's done with love, he's too old for everything now. He just puts it away from him. I feel like that is done so well. And then when he finally realises how Amy feels about him and how that changes his own feelings about her, I just love it. Basically, I really, really love Amy and Arthur's love story, but I also love how that really springs out of an exploration of unrequited love. And speaking of unrequited love, of course there is John Chivery's for Amy, which I really enjoy. John Chivery is very sweet, and I really enjoy his composing gravestones for himself and his head. Excellent. I really enjoy his devotion for Amy. And of course we have Amy's love for Arthur, which is unrequited for the vast majority of the book, and is really beautifully, powerfully written, I would say. The way she tries to protect herself by putting a distance between them, the way she knows they are separated by his love for another person and their different social positions in the first half of the book, and then in the second half of the book they are again separated by circumstance, because her social position is now above his rather than below, and because she knows her father would never want to see Mr. Clenham again, because Mr. Clenham knew him in his old life and he just can't bear to go back there and to consider it again. I love the story Amy tells Maggie about the princess and the shadow, as her way of explaining that she has this secret passion for Arthur that she can't do anything about and that she will never do anything about, but that she will carry with her always, and that she will value because it doesn't do anyone harm, so why not love him? I think it's lovely. I love that letters you get from Italy in the second half of the book where Amy writes to Arthur, and I really just love their love story, basically. I love the way that Dickens explores unrequited love through Amy throughout a lot of the book, but I also love that they end up together and the happiness that is between them at the end. And I think one of the reasons why this is the best love story in Dickens for me is, one, because they're two of my favourite protagonists and they're both really rich, developed characters, but also because they begin as friends and they grow to be more. And I just think that's done so well. And let's not forget that Amy proposes to him at the end, which is very fun and quite rare for a Victorian novel. I have nothing in the world. I am as poor as when I lived here. When Papa came over to England, he confided everything he had to the same hands, and it is all swept away. Oh, my dearest and best, are you quite sure you will not share my fortune with me now? Now I'm into spoilers. I did want to return to the themes of class, money, and capitalism, because there are a lot of very interesting things going on here. I think Mr. Dorrit's reversal of fortunes, and how that changes their class, and how that impacts their class pride and their social position as a family is really, really interesting, because you see so much kind of class anxiety. Like when they were in the Marshalsea prison, Fanny and Mr. Dorrit were able to be proud kind of without anxiety, because they were at the bottom of society, but they view themselves as being above that. Whereas when they're abroad, Mr. Dorrit is so anxious that someone will see that he doesn't belong. He's so anxious that someone will find out about the past. He becomes completely paranoid about it, because he is so ashamed of his past, and because he is proud to be a gentleman again and to be wealthy again, but he doesn't really feel confident in his social position. And I think that's explored really, really interestingly and works very well. Money and capitalism are also so central to Little Dorrit, and money is really kind of what drives the plot. It's Mr. Dorrit and his debt, and Mr. Panks trying to uncover money that might belong to Mr. Dorrit. It's the craze for investing in Mr. Merdle. It's Clennam's management of Mr. Joyce's affairs. It's Clennam ending up in debt himself at the end. And this is all so important within Little Dorrit. I find Mr. Merdle such an interesting character, and I feel like the sudden clamour to invest in his company and then his suicide and ruin is a really, really interesting plot point, and touches on kind of the dangers of capitalism, which is something you do see explored in other Victorian novels as well. Little Dorrit, he looks at money quite interestingly, because money is both necessary and kind of ruinous. We see that the people in Bleeding Heart Yard are struggling because of their lack of money. We see that Mr. Dorrit and his family are struggling because of their lack of money. We see how debt has ruined Mr. Dorrit and ruins Arthur later. But we also see how the people in high society are absolutely awful. Like, you know, Mrs. Merdle and Mrs. Gowan, they're not really the people you would want to be your models for life, are they? Little Dorrit is definitely one of those Victorian books that is very much about, like, why the best thing to be is a hardworking middle-class person, which is, you know, a bit of an obsession with the Victorian period. I always think that the very ending of Little Dorrit, where Charles Dickens says that Amy and Arthur walked out into the street after their marriage and went down into a modest life of usefulness and happiness. That was like the most Victorian sentence that has ever been. Go down to your modest life of usefulness and happiness. That's all you should be looking for in life. Make sure you're useful and live a modest life, and you'll definitely be happy. That's just so entirely Victorian. Another interesting theme in Little Dorrit is sort of trauma and how the past can haunt you. You know, we have this do not forget motto that Mrs. Clennam is concerned with, because the letters DNF are engraved into her watch, which as a modern person who watches a lot of BookTube, I do find very entertaining whenever it says DNF. I just feel like if you weren't getting on with Little Dorrit, that would be the point to put it down. But anyway, it means do not forget within the context of this book. This was a message from Mrs. Clennam's husband to her, to tell her not to forget the wrongs she had done, but she takes it as something else, and she remembers the past and tries to feel proud of what she had done, even though I think maybe a little bit of her knows that she had made mistakes and judged things incorrectly. But we also have a character like Mr. Dorrit, who also doesn't forget and can't forget. You know, I think Mr. Dorrit in the second half of the novel is really, really interesting, because he has spent, you know, more than 2 decades in the Marshalsea prison for debt, and he comes out and he is determined to make the most of life and to have this, you know, big wealthy lifestyle that he couldn't have before. But he also can't bear to even mention the past at all. You know, there's so many bits where he sort of breaks off mid-sentence or can't quite talk about what has happened to him. And, you know, his paranoia that anyone abroad, including his servants, might get wind of the fact that he used to be in prison. He's so terrified of this. And I feel like you get a really strong sense of how much trauma he has from having been in prison for that long, and how impossible it is for him to get past that. And I think that's one of the things that makes me feel very sorry for Mr. Dorrit, because I do think you can see how his experiences have had such a profound impact on him. Arthur is also a character who carries around a lot of kind of difficult feelings about his childhood. His very strict upbringing has left him kind of having a very difficult relationship with his mother, and with the home that he grew up in and the business that he worked for many years. Another theme that is quite interesting in Little Dorrit is the theme of illegitimacy. This is a theme that comes up a lot throughout Dickens's books, and that comes up a lot in Victorian literature. The stigma around being illegitimate was very prevalent in the Victorian period, but it was also something that was being continually challenged by a lot of Victorian writers. And we have quite a few different characters who are illegitimate within Little Dorrit. We have Miss Wade and Tattycoram, and we also have Arthur, as we discover later. His mother, Mrs. Clenham, is not actually his biological mother, and his father had an affair, and then he was the product of that affair. So Arthur is also illegitimate, although he does not know this. I feel like Tattycoram, or Harriet as maybe we should be calling her, I feel like she is a very interesting character in terms of the way her arc explores illegitimacy, because in many ways for me she feels like an anti-Esther Summerson. Like, she occupies a position that is very, very similar to Esther Summerson in Bleak House. She's been taken into a household as somewhere between servant and companion to a pretty young woman, and her position within the household is a bit ambiguous. Is she a member of the family? Is she an employee? It's a little bit hard to tell. Minnie, or Pet, really reminds me of Ada from Bleak House. I think partly because she's, you know, young, very beautiful, cheerful, nice, kind, but not as well developed as other female characters in the book. And also because she marries someone who is kind of going to let her down. I think Richard's a much nicer person than Mr. Gowan, but you still get that sense from both Ada and Minnie that, like, they sort of know they're making a bad decision, but they're going to make it anyway because they can't help who they love. So I think the fact that Pet kind of reminds me of Ada makes me think even more about the connections between Harriet and Esther Summerson, because Harriet has a very similar position to Esther. You know, she's illegitimate, she doesn't know who her parents are, and she's in this household where she's got a complicated position. But Harriet has a very, very different temperament to Esther, and while Esther is all kind of meekness and duty, Harriet is not. I find Harriet's arc really difficult, and I don't really like it, as I'll talk about in a minute, but I do think she's very interesting to look at in terms of the themes of illegitimacy, and so is the character of Miss Wade. Miss Wade is illegitimate, and she has spent her whole life believing that everyone hates her because of this. The suggestion from Dickens is, I think, that this is often paranoia rather than genuine prejudice, although her illegitimacy and her lower social position is definitely one of the reasons why Mr. Gowan was able to take advantage of her. The letter we get from Miss Wade explaining her life to Arthur Clenham is really interesting. And I feel like the way Miss Wade talks about the bitterness that she felt about everyone who ever patronised her because of her social position is really interesting if you compare it to Esther Summerson. And I feel like in a way Miss Wade and Harriet are there kind of as foils to Esther Summerson. You know, Esther Summerson has a very similar social position to them, and when people are kind to Esther, she almost is like so grateful because she kind of in her heart doesn't really think she deserves it. You know, I don't think Esther ever really thinks that her social position as someone who's illegitimate is unfair. Like, I don't think that would really register with Esther, whereas Miss Wade and Harriet definitely do think that their social position is unfair, and that means that when people are kind to them rather than being grateful as Esther is, they are angry because it feels patronising. And I feel like they're right to be angry, and I don't know that Dickens does think that, but I think the possibility of interpreting their anger as justified is there in the text, so I don't really know. Anyway, let me move on from themes to plot. I feel like I should talk about the big midpoint twist and sort of turn of the novel. Throughout the first half of the novel, Amy's father is in prison for debt and they have no money. And then Mr. Hanks manages to track down, through his interest in family history, the fact that actually Mr. Dorrit is the heir to a massive fortune. And so we move from Amy's family being very, very poor to Amy's family being exceptionally wealthy. They move from London to Italy, and we have this whole section of the book where they're abroad kind of living the high life, I guess, and Amy feels completely out of place. It's such an interesting decision, and it works so well. And the first time I read the book, I was so surprised. You know, literally the two books of Little Dorrit are called Book the First, Poverty, and Book the Second, Riches. And it's really interesting to see how Dickens, you know, looks at money and class through this change, and how he takes the plot in a very different direction in the second half. Little Dorrit is kind of a rags to riches story, except it's actually like a rags to riches to not exactly rags, but somewhere a bit above rags, because all the money that Mr. Dorrit inherited is lost in the big Myrtle fraud, and Amy ends the story not that much better off than she began, except a lot happier because, you know, she's married to Arthur now and they're gonna go and be happy and useful. Don't forget how important the Victorians thought it was to be useful. But I really enjoy the midpoint twist, and I feel like that change halfway through Little Dorrit is so interesting and done so well. This obviously ties in with Mr. Myrtle and his plotline, and I do think his suicide and the fraud that is exposed and how many people are ruined by it is really, really interesting. It's such an interesting plot element in Little Dorrit, and one of the reasons why I really love Little Dorrit is because of Mr. Merdle and his plotline. I think it's very interesting, and it's kind of very critical of capitalism, or of sort of capitalism with no checks, in a way that you find in at least one other Victorian novel I can think of, and that is really interesting. Another very important element of the plot is, of course, the Blandois, Rigaud, Clennam mystery thing, which I do think is a little bit confusing. Like, I do think that the ending and the explanations that we get, and the fact that Jeremiah had a twin brother who Monsieur Rigaud / Blandois killed to get some secret documentation off him that he then is trying to blackmail Mrs. Clennam with, like, it is a bit convoluted. And also it's sort of set up as a really important central mystery, but it then kind of like takes a bit of a backseat for a lot of the novel. So I don't think it's like Dickens' best plotline ever, but I kind of don't really care because I love the novel so much, and I feel like the novel is at its heart about money and love rather than it is about this secret. But yeah, I don't think it's Dickens' best plotline. Another plotline I find a bit frustrating in Little Dorrit is the Tattycoram / Harriet plotline. I think especially the ending of Harriet's plotline, where she kind of comes and begs the Meagles to take her back, and I'm like, yeah, but they were really patronising towards you though, weren't they? I find Mr. Meagles a difficult character because I really like his relationship with Arthur, and I do feel that his heart is in the right place. But where I would really like that plot arc to go is Mr. Meagles to realise that he has been very patronising towards Harriet, and he doesn't really realise that at the end. I think there's one bit at the end where he's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have called you a really silly sounding name. And she's like, no, it's fine, I like it now. And I'm like, yeah, but do you, Harriet, though? Do you? Again, very Victorian middle class paternalism. I'm not very surprised that that's the direction the plot goes on within a Victorian novel, but I do find it a bit frustrating. Another kind of interesting element of the Miss Wade Harriet plotline is the fact that Harriet runs away with a woman who Mr. Meagles says has a, like, unusual influence on her. It's very hard not to find some lesbian undertones going on in the Harriet-Miss Wade dynamic, I think, whether Dickens put them there or not. Although I feel like how much they are there depends on how old Harriet is. Harriet is often referred to as a girl, and I feel like in my head, Harriet's like a similar age to Minnie and Amy. She's, you know, like in her very early 20s, maybe very late teens. But I did also see the 2008 miniseries quite soon after the first time I read Little Dorrit, in which Harriet is clearly an adult. So how much that has influenced how I read her as a character, I don't know. Because I do find when I listen to the Juliet Stevenson audiobook, the voice she has gone for Harriet is much younger. Like, it makes her sound more like she's sort of 15, 16. And in that case, I feel like that changes the dynamic between her and Miss Wade quite a lot, if Miss Wade is a lot older than her. Still, though, we do have this suggestion within the novel that Harriet is, like, very passionate, very angry. She's run away with a woman who has some kind of mysterious influence on her. And now she's going to come back and be a reformed, good Victorian girl at the end. And it does have a little bit of a, like, Harriet's going to reform her sexual misconduct vibe, which, you know, is not great. We were also talking a bit on the Discord server about whether or not Harriet is written or coded as being a person of colour, which I think is debatable within the book. I think that's fairly open to interpretation. I do think Dickens is trying to imply in his descriptions of Harriet that perhaps she's not entirely English, but there were also a lot of stereotypes within Victorian society about Spanish and Italian women being, like, more passionate than English women and stuff. So I don't know whether Harriet's necessarily meant to be a person of colour or just from a different bit of Europe, but I do think Dickens does kind of purposely describe her as looking different, I guess, which, you know, kind of makes her arc even more uncomfortable in many ways. I feel like Harriet is the bit I struggle with the most because I'm definitely not on the same side as Dickens. But anyway, before I wrap up this video, I did want to return to the love story of Arthur and Amy, because I think that is the best thing in this book. I think it's so well done, and that is the reason why I love this novel so much, and it's the reason why Little Dorrit ranks so highly for me. I feel like the love story is hands down the best love story in Dickens in terms of the believability of the characters' emotions for each other and the believability of the arc towards them both being in love with each other. Like, it's a slow burn love story that is elegant and smooth, and, you know, it's unrequited at first. Amy falls in love with him, and he, you know, he's in love with someone else. But then we have the kind of crisis of his life. He ends up in the Marshalsea prison for debt. He has this illness, and finally Amy is helping him after all the times that he helped her earlier on in the book. And then I love the very end where she offers him her fortune and he won't share it because he is trying to be chivalrous. And then turns out all her father's money was lost with Mr. Myrtle, so she has no money. And she's like, well, now do you want to come marry me? Oh, my dearest and best, are you quite sure you will not share my fortune with me now? I know I did already read that bit earlier, but I love it. I just find their love story so moving. Like, I just cried through a lot of the end of the audiobook. And I really, really like their love story. There are obviously a lot of love stories within Dickens novels, and a lot of Dickens books end with marriages or many, many marriages, but I feel like Little Dorrit is the real, like, true love story of all of Dickens's books, and I think it's a wonderful love story, and that's the reason I think why this ranks so highly for me. There are a lot of other things I love, a lot of characters and plot lines and elements of it that I think are fantastic, but it's the love story, I think, that really uplifts Little Dorrit for me and makes it one of my favourite Dickens books and one of my favourite novels of all time. I don't think there's anything left to say, but I also feel like I've been filming for a really, really, really long time, so I'm sorry if this video has been exceptionally long, but I loved Little Dorrit and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. Do let me know down in the comments if you read Little Dorrit over the last couple of months. What did you think? That's all for now, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.